Hello, I'm going to be reading chapter 10 now of my book, Alcohol and Pregnancy, My Responsible Disturbance. I'm getting a little bit less, what's the word, official or formal, I suppose. So I'm just going to read it, add little bits here and there, but we have at least one person watching these videos, so I'm really stoked. Okay, so by this time I was suffering from what I now know to be postnatal depression. At the time I didn't understand that the sadness I felt was something that was diagnosable. I had been depressed for so long I thought it was merely who I was. I felt lost, anxious and overwhelmed by the problems with my little boy. Anxiety and fear took the form of feeling driven to do everything perfectly. Of course, parenting Mick was not something I had any chance of mastering, so I continually felt inadequate at what I thought should be the most natural job in the world, being a mum. I felt so drained and fatigued, I wondered if perhaps I had leukemia or some other deadly disease. I didn't have the energy to do anything other than meet Mick's basic needs. He was vulnerable and small and needed me so much, but I was so sad, tired and bone weary, and maybe even sick. At 4 months, he couldn't even hold his head up, let alone roll over as he was supposed to be doing at that age. Our friend's baby, born 1 month after Mick, was rolling over, smiling and making sounds. Mick hadn't done any of those things. I again wondered if maybe there was something wrong with him. None of the doctors we visited had diagnosed anything more than flu or upper respiratory tract infection, or URTI, and never offered an explanation for his constant illness and delays. There was no internet in those days, and all I had to go on was the pace at which my friend's daughter was developing. Because we lived out in the bush too, there was no library I could go to either, and my mother wasn't the sort of person I would go to ask these questions. And my husband's mum, who was fantastic, I just felt embarrassed, I guess, that I had to, that I couldn't parent this poor little baby. Mick's irritability and crying had somewhat abated after he went on to soy milk, completely dissipated in his 5th month, and he became what I thought was a normal baby, apart from his developmental milestones, which he didn't meet. It was such a huge relief to me, to all of us. He'd play in his cot by himself for long periods if I let him, and that worried me in a totally different way. He didn't seem to respond to certain stimuli and appeared quite content to just lie and move his little fists around as though he was looking at them from every angle. It was a strange sort of thing. I don't think I've seen babies do it, but he'd hold his little wrist up like this and just look at it like that. Just do that all the time. It was cute. He would hold them up to his face and move them around like he wanted to. I think I've said that. A baby who has not opened. This is something that I learned. Only a few years ago at a conference I think it was the London conference. So it must have been around 5 years ago. A baby who has not opened his or her hands by 3 months of age and is doing what Mick did with closed fists is a predictor of problems later in life with reading and writing, because they're all related to the injury to the limbic system. And that was a quote from Dr. Ira Chasnoff at that conference. So, I never saw Mick cross the midline, so cross over to the other side of his body. So everything he did at that age was done directly by his right hand to his right, to the right part of his body, and by his left hand to the left part of his body. So crossing the midline is crossing that line between left and right. And a neurotypical child should be able to cross the midline. Now that I could do things other than care for him, I started paying more attention to the house. went cleaning one day. I accidentally tripped over a pot plant on the floor while he was playing in his little bouncinette thing that was around in those days. I made a lot of noise, but he didn't seem to hear it. He didn't startle or cry, and indeed he didn't even turn his head toward the noise. It was very obvious and noticeable. There was far too much noise for any hearing person to ignore. So I gathered some saucepans to reproduce the level of noise and moved behind him. I banged softly on the pots, gradually increased the level until I reached a crescendo that even the neighbours could have heard. Mick didn't flinch. He didn't react or respond in any way. He continued to play, looking at his fists, turning them this way and that, intent and focused, but completely lost in his own world and not in the world with me. And this is another aside. So children with FASD can often have a condition called central auditory processing disorder, which is not a mechanical hearing problem at all, but a problem processing sounds. So when we hear through our ears, obviously. The sound goes through the ear canal and into our brain, and the meaning of the sound is processed by the brain. So somebody who's deaf will have a mechanical hearing problem. Something will be wrong with their ear. But with central auditory processing disorder, there's nothing actually wrong with the ear, but the part of the brain that's processing the sound. Our doctor agreed that a hearing test would be helpful, as even at such a young age, 5 or 6 months, the results could give an audiologist an indication as to whether he required interventions and whether they would be for mechanical problems or processing problems. The testing itself took about half an hour, and at the end, the audiologist reported no evident hearing impairment, but recommended a follow-up before he went to school. When he was 6 months old, I took him to his paediatrician for a regular checkup. The doctor performed tests on his reflexes and observed him play and interact with me. Mick was fairly compliant, and although I didn't see any glaring problems, at the conclusion of the consultation, the paediatrician said that Mick could very well be retarded. His words. He didn't mention any reason for this conclusion, that Mick could be retarded, nor did he suggest there was anything that could be done to help him. I must take some responsibility for this lack of information, because I could have asked him what had given him that impression. I think I didn't ask because I wasn't sufficiently confident to do so, and I believed that if the doctor or any doctor wanted me to know something, they'd tell me. But that's not how the system works. If you want to know something, you ask. Don't wait for someone to tell you. Don't wait for a medical professional to tell you. So this is a news article that I found. Health Day News, it's called. It says, among youth in the United States, the rate of misdiagnosis or misdiagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is 86.5%, according to a study published online on January the 12th, 2015 in the Pediatrics Journal. Imagine what it's like over here if it's 86.5 over there. Ira Chasnoff, MD, from the Children's Research Triangle in Chicago, and colleagues collected data from a sample of 547 children among a population of foster and adopted youth who underwent a comprehensive multidisciplinary diagnostic evaluation. Children were diagnosed with FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, or alcohol-related birth defects using current diagnostic criteria. That's not our diagnostic criteria these days. FASD is actually the diagnosis. The researchers found that 125 of the 156 children and adolescents who met criteria for a diagnosis within the fetal alcohol spectrum had never been diagnosed as affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. So the missed diagnosis rate of 80.1%. Of the 31 children who'd been recognised as affected by prenatal alcohol exposure before referral, 10 diagnoses were changed within the spectrum, so that's a misdiagnosis rate of 6.4. The diagnosis of the remaining 21 children stayed the same. Significant changes were seen in the rate of mental health diagnosis. In a considerable number of children with FASD, objective signs of neurocognitive damage, so that's learning disorders, communication disorders, and intellectual disability, were not recognised. Within this clinical sample, 86.5% of youth with FASD had never been previously diagnosed or had been misdiagnosed. These high rates of misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis have significant implications for intervention and therapeutic services. That actually leads me to something that I spoke about in my previous video, and that's about GPs not diagnosing FASD. I think I'll make that a separate video, because this is about this book. But I'm definitely going to talk on this before I leave the FASD arena in Australia. This is clearly this issue about GPs not missing these diagnoses is just drives me insane to think that that's what's happening to our kids. Okay, back to the book. Of course, over the years and many consultations later, my view has changed radically. My view about thinking that if the doctor wanted me to know, he'd tell me. I wanted to do something to help Mick before his next appointment. I had to use my imagination. I had no idea what caused the paediatrician to say what he said, that my boy could be retarded. So I really didn't know where to start to help him. And this is another little aside. So Mick's true diagnosis was missed in 1981. In those days, it was probably missed about 100% of the time in Australia. While that might be understandable given the lack of knowledge in this country at the time, the research by Dr. Chasnoff outlined in the previous text was conducted in 2014 and written up in 2015. In Australia, even then, misdiagnoses and missed diagnoses would have been much higher than 86%. A diagnosis is critical for the prevention of future exposed births. I wonder how many children were born with FASD after a proper diagnosis of their older sibling was missed, like Mick and Seth. So if Mick had been diagnosed with FASD then, or at some point before I had Seth, Seth would not have had FASD. So I decided on a simple exercise first. I rolled a sheet of foam rubber into a cylinder and covered it with fabric from an old curtain. Every day I rolled him back and forth, making a wonderful little game out of it. I worked with him every day for hours, trying to figure out ways to stimulate his physical and neurological functioning. Not that I knew what I was doing at the time. At our follow-up with the paediatrician when he was 12 months old, he was pronounced normal. Words that released the icy fingers of dread from around my heart. Until he was 3 years old, when he had his tonsils and adenoids out, there were no other memorable problems with his health, apart from the almost weekly trips to the medical centre for URTI, upper respiratory tract infections, ear infections or viruses. He had become an easygoing, happy, seemingly normal child. My little boy. Not a moment too soon either, because I was about to go crazy. As a toddler, he was very trusting, and I had to be very cautious when we were out, as he was likely to go with strangers, eyes shining with curiosity and delight. He didn't seem to have any concept of fear or understanding of consequences of things. As he got older, he became more cautious about traffic and riding his bicycle, but still remained overly naive about people. I always remember his lovely little voice saying, "Be careful, Mummy, be careful." He is such a cutie. God, he is so beautiful. Poor social awareness. Oh, this is another point from NoFAS UK, from the United Kingdom. Poor social awareness is yet another aspect of the brain injury associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Young children may not understand the important early childhood concept that familiar people are safe and strangers can be dangerous. This lack of stranger anxiety may appear in extreme form. Some affected children seem to regard all adults with the same trust and confidence with which they regard their parents. And that's the end of chapter 10. Thank you very much.